So, welcome to Andrew McLean. Second time here with the HorseTribe. Thank you very much for coming back again, Andrew. We're delighted to have you again. I know some of you would have met Andrew last time he was here chatting to us a few weeks ago. But just for those who don't know him, he's co-director of the Equitation of Science International and winner of the Australian Eureka Prize for Science. Andrew's developed and manages the Australian Equine Behaviour Centre and specialises in horse training and behaviour modification. You've got a list of qualifications about as long as my arm, including a PhD in equine cognition and learning. And I know you've been a riding coach as well for many, many years. So, Andrew, we are absolutely delighted to have you back again in the HorseTribe. And thank you very much. Thea and I will disappear until question time and leave you to do your talk. Thank you very much.
And maybe just before we hand over, just to say, if you think of questions at any point, do please pop them in the Q&A section at the bottom. It doesn't matter when you type them. We'll think as you think of them, pop them in, and we'll ask them of Andrew at the end. So we'll see you in a bit.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be here again. And it's also a topic that is a dear one to me, because that's this topic of the aids and how the horse perceives them was really my burning question when I first began my journey into academia, because originally I was a zoologist and I was teaching at the university, but just teaching standard zoological subjects like genetics and cell biology and biochemistry. And then I was also eventing on a horse that actually came from where I grew up on King Island in between Australia and Tasmania, a little flat island. And this horse was one of the survivors of a shipwreck, or his ancestors were, quite a few generations ago, that swam ashore. And they're quite inbred, but he was an extraordinary little horse, a funny shape, and but a really good jumper. And I wasn't a great dressage rider or anything like that. Of course, I lived on the island and I learned in Pony Club. But he took me through show jumping when I went to Tasmania to university, and then I had a love for eventing, and my dressage really held me back in those early days. And you know, I could never even get him on the bit, but he was a great jumper. But those experiences led me to the questions about, why does the horse do what we want him to do? Because you know, the standard answer was always, well, it's a willing to please animal. But as a zoologist and, you know, learning about a more critical thinking approach, I began to really question as to why an animal would evolve to make us happy. There must be something else going on. And so that was really the beginning of my lifelong journey. So when we do look at the aids, as you can see, and that's why I've chosen these sorts of pictures, not for any other reason except that they show people doing various things on horses. But the few connecting themes are that, you know, we always seem to have reins in our hands. And of course, there are people who ride with a rope around the neck and with bitless bridles and all of those sorts of things. And that's very good. And probably bitless bridles is how we will go in the future when you look at the effects of social license to operate, and those sorts of really big burning questions about animal ethics and how we use horses. And I think they're really important that as we evolve culturally in our species. But nonetheless, we use the reins via the horse's mouth. Obviously, the mouth is a very sensitive part because it works. When we pull on the reins, we can train the horse through the release of pressure to slow and stop and step back and all of those sorts of things, and one rein to turn. And that's not necessarily universal in all animals. For example, with camels and other animals, especially other ungulates, it doesn't work to have a bit because of the different tooth arrangements and the fact that horses have a diastema, which is convenient. That's the gap in the mouth. So with those animals like camels, you have a peg in the nose. It seems a pretty dastardly thing to do, but just to explain the differences, that, you know, that's the sensitivity. And with bulls, they often lead them with a ring through their nose. That's another sensitive part that obviously works to train by pressure release. Again, I don't endorse that. I'm just saying they're the differences. And for getting the animals to go, it's our legs around the horse's body. And that's obviously a sensitive enough part that for most horses, that seems to work. With elephants, it's a little bit different. You know, it's our toes on behind the elephant's earlobes that are the signals for go and for turn. And as you draw your heels back towards the shoulders, they're the signals for stop and step back. So we are working on sensitivity. So that's a little bit of a teaser and an opener to start with. And so when we look at what we call the aids, you know, it came from the French aider, meaning to help. And originally, the idea of the aids was that the aids were reins and legs. It wasn't seat. In the beginning, it was those were seen as separate effects, and then they coalesced because people realized that the seat has quite a strong influence on the way the horse goes, and you can also alter the way the horse goes, and you can damage your communication to the horse with the incorrect use of weight. How much you can damage it, we actually don't know because it's very difficult to measure it. There are seat pad sensors and things like that. But nonetheless, we do know, and riding coaches know that, you know, poor riding position can make a difference to the way the horse goes. But what I want to draw out is and I'll be focusing on this a bit later, is the primacy of the reins and legs, because they're a different form of learning than the seat. And that different form of learning is much more thoroughly and much more deeply embedded and is less optional than the horse's response to voice or seat or things like that that are learned by what we call classical conditioning. The origin of these words, though, is something that I'm quite intrigued about too, because, you know, we use the word aids to help the horse, seemingly, and now the word aid is just part of our equestrian dialogue, but it all came about also through our use of the horse as an animal of utility in war and agriculture, and then later on in sport. And so we see, you know, words that pop up as well in the way we describe horses, like loyalty. You know, the horse is a loyal servant. Work ethic, you know, he has a steadfast attitude to pull that plough for however many hours a day. These are all part of a narrative that are about how we train horses and about the story with humans and horses. And so when we try to understand horses, they do get in the road of a more thorough and a more objective understanding about horses. You know, it's hard to remove the veil of those things like loyalty. Whenever people talk about, if you ask anybody about how the horse understands the aids or whatever, terms like loyalty and willing to please and all of those sorts of things will eventually creep in. Things that are quite difficult to measure and to know. And there are more concrete ways of understanding how the horse learns, which are actually testable and knowable. Also, in terms of this will to win, you know, more recently, and I think I wanted to point this out, is that, you know, we start to then view the horse in sport as an athlete. And so there's a lot of talk about that. And I was I was at the meeting as the behavior expert when the roll curve first came about as a big subject almost 2 decades ago. And it was interesting because that's where the term horse as an athlete came in, and it's been really hammered ever since that the horse is an athlete. But it's interesting, it's not really viewed as an athlete, I don't think, in a serious way, because if it were, why isn't the horse listed as an athlete in the honor rolls of the IOC or the FEI, like the rider is? I think it's a different approach, but it's more that's part of the narrative behind it all. And so that's why we have terms like commands. You know, it's rather, you know, more military, where we say we give the horse the command and he does the job. So I'm trying not to make a value judgment about any of this. I'm just throwing it all in, that this is part of the whole package of our communication that has quite an intense narrative behind it. And on top of that, there are some confusing elements to it because, for example, it's been very common throughout our pony club history as well, in most understandings of horse riding, that we use the terms the artificial aids and the natural aids, and that division's useless because many of the artificial aids and many of the natural aids are learned in similar or the same way, and some of them are learned in, so that there's not a clear dichotomy at all. For example, the natural aids of the reins and the legs and the seat, so-called, are learned. The legs and reins are learned by operant conditioning, but the seat's learned largely by classical conditioning. The artificial aids like the whip, for example, and the spur are both learned by operant conditioning, whereas the voice is learned by classical conditioning. And I'll go into those a bit later, but basically operant conditioning are things that you can enforce and that work by pressure release on and off, where the on part is the motivating part for the horse to do what you want, hopefully. And if he doesn't, you keep it on. And when he does, then you release it. Like rein pressure, leg pressure, tapping for the horse to go forward. You keep tapping till he goes forward and then you stop when he does go forward. That's operant conditioning. That's the negative reinforcement aspect. But the voice command that comes before it, that becomes associated just simply by the fact that it's always with it. If you're a good trainer, you say, walk on just before you tappity tap every single time. And very soon walk on works because of the predictable element of that word or that voice command that comes before it. But it has no power. So if the horse doesn't walk on, saying it repeatedly, all it does is diminish the effect of it in the future and makes the horse more immune to it. So that's something worth thinking about. And so where do the reins come from? Well, I've already talked about the legs and the reins and the voice and the spurs to some extent, but it's something worth thinking about because when you look at the rider sitting on the horse, and when you look at all of the things that we want from the horse, especially in dressage, which is by far the most complex of all of the things we want to do, we've got a very limited place to give signals in terms of the rider's position. We can use our lower leg, our heel, our calf, our knee, and we can use our seat to some extent. The seat, I did say, was largely learned by classical conditioning, in other words, by simple association. So, like Pavlov's dog, some of you know those experiments where Pavlov gave the dog, just before he gave the dog meat powder in an experiment, let's say meat, just before he gave the dog meat, he would ring the bell, and very soon the ringing of the bell made the dog salivate, just like your dog does when you open the refrigerator door or the door to the cupboard where his food is. That's classical conditioning. And they're very, very good at that. All animals tend to be, because it's about noticing your environment. But the seat is like that because it becomes associated. It has, if you only had a seat on a horse and no legs and no reins and no whip tap or anything else, you probably wouldn't get much out of a horse, in fact. And there'd be no horse riding at all, in my view, because the seat's powerless. You can, in saying that, there's some power to it in that you can put a bit of pressure on the horse's back in various ways, left and right and forward and back, and you can follow the oscillating movements of the horse's back. So there's a minor part of pressure release of operant conditioning, but mostly it's classical conditioning. So it's a very intricate and complex thing, horse riding and the seat and the position and the weight aids. And that's what makes it so interesting. And that's really how equitation science came about, was trying to distill what is going on. We've got a pretty good idea now in the science of equitation science, but the difficulty is getting it out into the outside world, because tradition is the old bastion that is difficult to overcome. the old narratives get in the way. If we can all learn how we would learn horse riding, and in fact, that's how we learn. That's how I teach in my diploma. That's how, as I'm on the board, national board, and being involved with the new syllabus in Australia for Pony Club, that's how we're teaching children these days, because it's just so easy to learn it that way compared to the foggy, murky way we learn the traditional way, which is sort of like a sieve with a glass ceiling that some people just never get there. And it's not because they're not talented. It's just because the narrative doesn't get through to their sensibilities. So we have all of these elements of our body position, and then moving up beyond the seat to the rider's shoulders and head and neck, even the way we use our upper body and the posture of our upper body can change the dynamics of what the seat registers that goes down into the horse's back. That can make a difference. So if we isolated all of these parts, which I think is the next big challenge in equitation science, this is something that intrigues me because my wife really loves teaching dressage and does it a lot. And we talk about this a lot. The incredibly intense effects of how messages can get enhanced or destroyed by all of these separate elements of, your head and neck position on your shoulders, your shoulder position, your elbow position, your elbow's ability to move up or down that alters seat characteristics to some extent. The way you use your back. And when I'm talking about this, I'm really talking about this in situ, in a still position. Imagine that the dynamics of the walk and the trot and canter are all completely different. The walk is an oscillating movement of under your seat. If you ever get the chance to ride bareback, do, because it's the greatest revelation. Everybody who teaches the seat should do that, because you can really feel what the back does. And the back moves in this oscillating way, not only forward and back, but also round as well. So it goes in a cyclic fashion, left and right, as you follow the rising of the scapula up and down, and the movement of the back and the lowering of the back as the hip goes lower. So all of that happens, and then we've got the effects of the seat. One side of the seat or the other side of the seat. So that's a conversation we can have again at another time. And then in the rider's hand, we may have a whip. How we use the whip. Where do we use the whip? We've got the choice, as you see with this rider. It's not a great photo, but it's just one that we chose to show the tools that people use typically. So the rider's got the whip, and the rider can tap the horse on the rump there. The rider could push the whip further down and tap further back on the rump, possibly, and lower down on the horse's leg. And then also, if the whip's held a little bit more vertically, the rider can tap the horse just behind the leg to enhance the go button, or even to replace the go button on what's known as a very lazy horse, a horse that's not motivated to go, or a horse whose go button has been destroyed by the incorrect use of the leg. And the overuse of pressure and the not releasing of pressure can very much make a horse lazy. And so a way of bringing that horse back into work can be by using whip taps, as long as they're not severe. The most important thing is the relentlessness, that you just keep tapping until you get the reaction you want, and then you immediately stop. And that microsecond of stopping makes all the difference in the world to the embedding of the correct reaction. And then, of course, we've got, on the leg, we've got the spur. The spur is used in the same way. Spurs, because of people's poor leg position, can really damage horses, because the spur inadvertently and unintentionally can be on all the time when it shouldn't be. And then we also have the bit in the horse's mouth as well. So we've got all of these possibilities. And then I also wanted to talk about all of the other senses as well, because all of those things I'm talking about are in the bottom left-hand corner of this diagram, and that is the horse's acute sense of touch. And we do know that the horse has this great sense of touch. And it's also important to recognize, and this is some studies done at Sydney University by Lydia Tong and her team, is that horses have the same amount and similar distribution and similar embedding of nociceptors as humans do. In other words, they feel pain the same as we do. So this discussion that's ongoing and ridiculous about the whip in racing, where people say the whip doesn't hurt, is just really stupid and makes no sense at all, because the horse, of course we know the horse feels pain, and it's just a way of justifying the wrong thing in the use of the whip. And I think that when the whip is used the way it is in racing, it really is a very questionable ethical thing, but it's part of the tradition. There are other ways we can get horses to do things by appealing to other senses. For example, horses have incredible vision. They are largely dichromats, not trichromats like us, and that means that they are largely red-green. They're like red-green colorblind, like red-green colorblind humans. They have 350 degrees of vision. They have a rod-dominated retina, so they see extremely well at night, because that's what it's for. Because after all, most of their predators were nighttime predators, not daytime predators. So they have extremely good vision at night, and not such great color vision as other animals, like birds, for example, have very much a cone-dominated eye as opposed to a rod-dominated eye. Because our background is a primate, we also have a better color vision than horses do, but not as good as birds do. So we have more cones than horses, but still not the sort of bizarre psychedelic world that a bird must perceive, that enables them such intense visual acuity in the daytime to see a mouse from a kilometre if you're a hawk or an eagle. But then at the same time, those birds have got to go to bed early because they can't see in the dark. And you see, that's a limitation for a prey animal like a horse. And at hearing, they have extraordinarily good hearing. Their hearing ranges from 50 hertz to 33.5 kilohertz. So they hear at higher frequencies than we do, which is odd for a big animal. As animals get bigger, usually they hear at lower frequencies. Our frequencies are 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. As I said, horses are 50 to 33. So that high frequency range is important for a prey animal in the open grassland where they evolve, because any high frequency creeping by a predator, it involves crackling of twigs and branches and shrubbery and grass. And horses are very attuned to that kind of crackling noise. That's why they don't like speaker crackling, and that's why cracks when a fire is crackling, or whip cracks, or even clicking. Those are all high frequency noises. And anything over 2 kilohertz, horses have, it's quite alarming for them, because they're unable to localize it over 2 kilohertz. So they do have good hearing. And the human voice range happens to sit quite neatly within the middle of their range. And so, voice commands can really can work well as long as we embed them correctly by classical conditioning. Down on the bottom right-hand corner, I've got the sense of smell. We tend not to use that in training, so I won't go on with that. When I talk about the horse's telos, basically that word means the horse's basic hard wiring. It's its genetic potential. So all animals are born with a genetic, even plants, with a genetic potential to do certain things. And what we do in training is we harness that by learning. We can superimpose on their genetic potential for whatever they do. So we can either confirm it or deny it through learning. So those tendencies that the horses are born with are quite incredible. The horse is born with, he already knows how to walk, trot and canter. He's born with the hard wiring in his telos for suckling and drinking milk. But he's not born with knowing where. That's why you see a foal going around the mother but as soon as it strikes gold, bingo, the foal doesn't forget where the milk comes from. And so when we think about that telos, the point of this for me is that we need to recognize that horses have certain coping strategies. And these are largely like ours. It's true for all animals. And it's different for this particular individual. All individuals are different. So some animals, their coping strategy is to just escape and run away. You probably know people like that. Maybe you're like that yourself. You walk away from an argument, just shut the door. It doesn't work. It doesn't resolve the argument. It doesn't resolve, nobody wins there. It just prolongs the problem. We have aggression, where we can fight back and we can appear to win. But again, nobody wins there. And we can also become apathetic, where we just basically tune out and even show contempt, which is the worst of human emotions, I think, because it's dismissive. It's worse than aggression. It's worse than any of the others in terms of communication for humans. And with animals, it's part of all animals, telos as well. They just basically tune out. And it's part of the journey to learned helplessness. When we use pain on animals, learned helplessness is very much about the immunization of animals to pain. When I say immunization, there's still physiological effects of pain that are really intense, but it's just that they, on the outside, show that they don't respond to pain anymore. So that's why we've seen pictures of horses in the past where they've been spurred and they've got spur wounds, but they don't even react to go forward anymore, or mouth lesions from the bit, and they still don't stop. That's the road to learned helplessness. In the full-blown effect of learned helplessness, this is something that's really important to know, because it's a dimensional disorder. It's not a categorical one. So dimensional means it's a long road to it, and it's cumulative. In the end, an animal with learned helplessness doesn't react at all to any kind of pressure. They're just basically tuned out and dead. And there are not really many of those. So what we see in the horse world, if we see learned helplessness, if we do see it, is animals along that track. Now, I don't think it's possible to train an animal without some effects of learned helplessness. I don't even think it's possible to be a human without some effects of that too. It may not be shown up through physical pain, but it could be shown up through psychological pain. Just a thought, but it's just that, coping in our world is not easy, and nor is it for the horse. And so we have to navigate through all of these things. And so training an animal involves, it's a strong imperative for us to have a good social license, because we need to do the best we can for these animals, because, we are their voice. They don't have a voice. And that's why it's really sickening if people just assume and dismiss the idea that the horse is just simply something you can use. And by using that, sugary narrative that the horse is just a willing to please animal, basically overshadows the reality that we could be doing damage. So we need to do it well. And I'm not trying to scare you so that you don't do it. I'm just saying, try to train well, learn about how horses learn. So this is the horse's basic hardwiring. Now, this is the bit I really wanted to get to, because this is about learning. And I've already mentioned operant and classical conditioning. Before I get to the left-hand side, if we look at the right-hand side, this explains it quite neatly before I get into the specifics. That, operant conditioning is all about something positive happening in your life. It could be the gaining of food, but it can also be the removal of pressure, because that's a positive thing to get rid of it. And the pressure could be the range of the legs, or the tapping of a stick, or even a harsh voice. They want to switch it off, and they want the food also to come. So it's about obtaining resources that involve the animal's satiation or comfort. And so animals learn to give reactions in order for them to profit from that. Classical conditioning is just really something that is embedded in animals. It's all the way through vertebrates, and it's even seen in invertebrates such as some insects. It's very old. It's evolved independently in certain animals like insects. But what it is, it's where animals learn to notice a signal in the environment or a stimulus in the environment that's always associated with this outcome of getting food or avoiding pressure. And that's how our voice commands work. That's probably how humans first learned language, was just by associating. You know, you say water and you point to the water. And if you say water often enough, that sound water becomes water. And that's how we first learn different languages ourselves. It's very much part of classical conditioning. But in humans, language learning is even more complicated. So there's more to it than that. But for animals, it is largely classical conditioning. I say largely, I think it's solely classical conditioning, that they learn these signals that come before something else that we do. So if we teach a horse to lead forward through pressure, we would go with the pressure, with our lead rein, and then as soon as the horse goes forward, we release the pressure. And once he gets anything like the hang of that, we start adding the voice command and we say, walk on, give the pressure straight away, release the pressure, good boy. And that's the best way to do it. So that's the use of negative reinforcement on the left-hand side, where we remove the pressure. So that's why it's negative. It's about removal of something. And then we also say, good boy. That's part of positive reinforcement. That's a secondary reinforcement for positive. And then we give the positive reinforcement by giving them a scratch at the base of the neck. So the two together are combined reinforcement. Positive and negative punishment are really about ways that humans have developed to, or animals do it too, to stop a behavior. So for example, if the horse kicks, it might get a smack from the whip. It only works if you have good timing. And the problem with it is that how do you know how much pressure to give? So it's a can of worms using punishment. And that's why it's pretty inaccurate in most cases. Often, you know, too much more than is necessary to stop the behavior. And there are quite significant emotional effects from that. Negative punishment is about the removal of something the animal wants. Commonly, it's about the removal of socialization, or, you know, taking yourself away. If the dog jumps up on you, you turn away, and that can teach the dog not to jump up on you. If the child's naughty in kindergarten, you put it in the naughty corner. I'm really not a fan of that, because I think social behavior is so important in animals. The need to socialize is so deep. We should never use that as a punisher, I don't think. I think that we must learn to privilege the importance of socialization in this century, because we know how damaging it is for humans, and horses are just as social as we are, and so are dogs. Now, classical conditioning, as I said, is just something that comes before. That's the word, you know, walk on, and horses are very clever at noticing little signals. And that's the light aid. So you give the horse the light touch of the rein aid, and he learns that that's associated with the stronger pressure and the release of that pressure. So he learns to respond to the light aid. And that's really, that is the absolute bedrock of classical equitation, is developing everything into the most lightest but imperceptible aids. It can also then translate to your voice command as well, and that's also classical conditioning. So we should really try to understand these. And as I said, that's why I've developed my diploma in Australia, which is a government recognised diploma, because I want to teach people how to use these tools effectively, because it makes such a difference to people's worlds and the horse's world, and it makes it a much safer thing. And so the basis of associative learning is the use of operant conditioning as bedrock. So that's these 4 pillars at the base of this pyramid. And let's recognize that classical conditioning is above those 4 areas. We've really got to install, through the use of the reins and the legs, primarily for these 4 basic pillars of go. And within the go, we should train, we need to separate the signals of differences between going up a gate, you know, from halt to walk and walk to trot. What's the signal you use for that? We need to separate tempo, like going faster within the walk or going faster within the trot. And I don't mean the body necessarily going faster, the body of the horse necessarily going faster. I mean the legs going faster. The legs go, you know, going from, you know, 1 2 1 2 to 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. How do we make it go faster? And then also, how do we make the legs go longer? Because that's really significant in many horse sports like dressage and jumping. We need alterations in stride length without alterations of tempo. And quite often we need alterations in tempo without alterations in length. We would, for example, in piaffe, we might want to make the piaffe quicker without longer. Separating that is really central to my approach in equitation science, because if any of these are blurred, horses start to tune out. In other words, they become less reactive to the pressure and people need to use more pressure. And then the horse is now on a downward spiral of mental welfare. At the other side of the pyramid, we've got stop. So we need to train the horse clearly to go down the gate slower and shorter. And same deal, how do we do it? How do we separate? Well, if you use our reins for slow, which we do because it's operant conditioning, because the seat isn't, you can't force the horse to stop or, you know, enforce it in any kind of way, but you can to a much greater extent with the reins via the bit or bitless bridle, and by closing your fingers on the reins, and when the horse stops, give. So we need to separate, how do we use the reins for going down a gate as opposed to shorter? We might go woo, a brief rein for shorter, which is common in dressage, but how do we ask the horse to go slower with the legs, but without going shorter? All of these things we've got to separate. In turns of the forelegs, we need to separate the difference, as the old classical equitation always did in Saumur and in the United Kingdom in the early military school at Weedon, the British Military Academy there. They used the French system of a direct turn, which is the open rein, and the indirect turn, which is the rein against the neck, to make the shoulders go away. Now, the Spanish always kept that because the Spanish equitation was the oldest, and that when the Spanish went to the Americas, that was maintained in the American versions of equestrianism in terms of the cutting horse and working cattle horses and Western pleasure. They still use the indirect turn. They call it a neck rein, but it's the same thing. We should reintroduce this because there's a lot of ridiculous negative judgment about the use of the indirect rein. And yet when you look at the top riders in the world and you look at all the old pictures of classical equestrianism, you will see, especially if you see photos from above, hands shifting from left to right, indirect and direct. So we need to train the horse to go from a single direct rein to turn his front legs to the right. When we use our right rein open, and if we close our right rein, the shoulders, the front legs should go left. Now, if we get all of these things right, and we spend time over 1.5 years of training, and we start that, they will become from light aids very rapidly learned. And then once these are all acquired by the horse, then we can start to look at consecutive arrangements of these basics in all of the movements that we do, like shoulder and trapeze, because they're nothing special. They're really just consecutive arrangements of those things. So a pirouette, for example, involves an element of turn the forelegs, an element of go, and an element of leg yield, of turning the hind legs away from the pressure of the leg that goes back to get the hindquarters to go sideways. And so recognizing those influences, and even the rein for slowing or shortening. If the pirouette's too big, we can use the outside rein and go whoa, and that shortens the step of the inside hind leg so that the pirouette gets smaller. The more we know about those mechanics, the better we will be at training. And then on top of that, there are all our postural effects. And as I said, then we start to use the consecutive arrangements. And sorry, I forgot about those pictures. There's a picture on the right-hand side of an indirect turn from the rider's left hand, where the right hand is more is together, but in the early stages of training it, the right hand should be more passive, just to ensure that the horse really does know what the closing rein does. And then after a while, the rein doesn't need to go so far to the neck. It's just really the rein touching the hairs on the neck that is the signal. And that is the art of training, where everything is just a whisper of the aids. Okay, and then shaping all the basics to right up to Grand Prix, as I said, is part of the long journey. It involves and that's what I'm trying to emphasize, that if you have problems, you should go back to these basics. If your horse is young, you should really embed these basics. If you're retraining, you should take longer to re-embed the basics, because that's the problem. The horse is confused about some elements of the basics, and when they're confused, they may show one of their coping mechanisms: running away and getting tense, aggression, where they fight, they might kick out, kick up, buck, whatever, or apathy, where they just tune out and become dead to the aid. These are all elements of confusion that we must turn the mirror on ourselves and fix that. So we go back to these basics as if we're starting the horse all over again. And in that regard, our seat is just really should be passive and not giving any kind of blurry signals that can interfere with the horse recognizing what that particular specific rein aid is asking the horse to do, or that leg aid. And then as we shape all of these things, now we've got the horse retrained or trained if he's only a young one, and we've got all of these things in the third column working well, and the horse can now do all of those sorts of things. Now we can work on the consecutive responses and start joining them all together, because not one of those higher movements involves anything different from the basics, except that in some cases, like Piaffe, for example, we might want to train the horse to lift the leg a little higher. So higher steps are the next thing, but they can actually evolve, and this has been known for 2 centuries in classical equitation. I've seen it myself in France with Michel Henriquet, a little bit of work I did there. You can, the horse can learn to do higher steps when you have him very clearly shortening in the trot, as well as slowing the trot to the slowest possible trot. And every time he walks, you say, no, not walk, back to the trot, now woo, slow again, now shorten. And as you do that, there'll be the odd higher step comes in. And it's a much more beautiful way of doing. And to be honest, it's probably the only sustainable way in the future, because it's a much milder way to train the horse. So these are the outcomes. And so this is, now I'm heading to another part of this journey and looking at perception. And without getting too far into it, I wanted to talk about this very briefly, and just to say it's quite a complex thing when the horse interprets the aid, because it goes through the somatic nervous system, through the thalamus, which is the gateway that transforms everything into a code, a neurochemical code that have nerves and nerve cells work in the brain and elsewhere, via the cortex, which either recognizes the aid as something it's done before, or it might be a novel aid, and in which case it goes through the learning parts all over again, which is down there at the striatum level, the basal ganglia, the nucleus accumbens, all of that part to the nucleus caudatus. That particular part is the heartland of learning. via the hippocampus, but down to this striatum. And it goes through that sequence and it becomes embedded as habits, with partly through the integration via the putamen, which is the middle segment of the basal ganglia. And if there is if there are sort of problems in the horse's life, it can start to short circuit. And that's actually what wind sucking, weaving, and crib biting are about, because those horses show some atrophy in the nucleus caudatus, which is the action outcome part of the basal ganglia. So in other words, it's a short circuit. So there's never really an outcome. It goes, it's a short circuit, and the horse just repetitively does this wind sucking, weaving thing. It basically gets stuck. The substantia nigra is the largest producer of dopamine in the body, and that's all about locomotion. So we give the aid. It's now been confirmed. The reaction is about to be given, and is given when it does happen. It's confirmed by the substantia nigra release of dopamine. And so we have now an action via the motor cortex of that particular response. And we may also end up with a habit if we're very clear and we repeat everything absolutely fundamentally clearly in the same way each time. We now have a habit, which is what we're trying to do. We must recognize that in training, we're training habits. We're not training horses to understand, because things go far too fast for that. And it's unfair to impose on the horse to understand anything. He simply reacts more likely. And that's our job, is to teach these clear reactions and reward them. And if we get things a bit wrong, or he has a really messed up life because he has no socialization, or unable to forage for more than 12 hours a day by eating hay, he just has 2 major feeds a day, he can develop stereotypies, such as crib biting, etc. So that's basically the complex and a very brief tour of the workings of the brain. I've mentioned before, I think, with this talk about affective states, but affective states are really about the horse's feeling of pessimism or optimism according to the reinforcement history of the horse. For example, if we've been clear in the past and there's always been a possible outcome for the horse in the use of the aids, he's more likely to give the response again, or to try a new response in the future. If nothing ever worked, and when pain arises from an aid and he's never been able to resolve it, he will have a negative affective state, which again is a cumulative dimensional disorder, and it will start to invade his life more and more, and he'll basically not bother to try things. And that's when horses appear to be dull or lazy, or all these humanistic terms we give them, which are grossly unfair, because it's in our hands to do it well. And so we can allow this. Now, the other parts of his life, apart from good, clear training, which is in that indented set of 5 bullet points, that's the clear, consistent communication. That's about training. Of course, he needs to be in optimal health conditions as well. So we need to do that. Most people are pretty good about that. These days, we recognize the importance of good nutrition, etc. But we don't recognize the importance of socialization and attachment to others. Ideally, we want to have the horse in a group situation. And I think people are far more nervous about horses getting hurt. The literature shows very clearly that when you put horse with other horses, the chances of getting injured are very much lower if they've had a chance to chat to each other, even for 5 minutes across the bars of the yard or whatever, before you turn them out together. And it's amazing what they do. And extensive foraging, that's just providing as much hay and high fiber, low carb food as much as we can. That's so important for them. And of course, adequate exercise. That's important too, because this is all part of their telos. These are their needs that are hardwired. We have to allow them. It's not something the horse feels like or wants. It's something he really must do. And if you prevent him from doing it, you throw him into the bag of negative affective states and on that downward mental spiral that leads to poor outcomes in training and poor outcomes in mental health for the horse. So this is the new world we need to understand. Instead of just discarding horses, there's many horses at the abattoir that are there for all of these reasons that could have been saved if we just learn more about training. And it really, I know I'm a little bit of a broken record about this, but it does my head in, because there's just so much we could do in the performance horse world. And although great trainers are very good at doing what they do because they're so effective at getting an outcome, they are most frequently don't know what they're doing. I've never found one that knows it all. And therefore, if there are mistakes that are made, that's part of the sieve that, oh, that horse didn't want to do dressage, or that horse didn't want to jump, or whatever it was. Maybe some do and some don't, who knows? But the thing is, we've got to give them the best chance through providing a good life, a worthwhile life, and clear training. That's how we build resilience, is through the predictability of the horse's life and using reward as much as we possibly can. And for me, that's much about tactile reinforcement, because they're tactile animals in this as social animals. We can also use food rewards as well. I think that's all very valuable part of our toolkits. The horse's arousal is really important, that we need to recognize that he has all these different systems of, lust and care and play and rage and grief. They're all important, and they predicate how the horse feels about things. And if we train well, we enable the horse to have good levels of arousal. We also can see that, and this is a new world in the literature, but when we look at human worry, it's quite similar to horse anxiety and other anxiety in other animals. I mean, worry is a bit of a different thing because of our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in our brain that gives us a different feeling about things. But basically, that level of tension and that lowered heart rate variability, where the heart maintains doesn't have enough variability and sort of flatlines a little bit, there's less variability, is part of anxiety. You would think that it'd be about big moves of heart rate, but it's not. Anxiety and stress are largely about lowered variability in the heart, where the heart rate doesn't move much. It's like fibrillation. So those things are important. Arousal is something we can maintain through enabling the horse to have those conditions that I mentioned in the previous slide. And the same with agency, the horse's choices. I've mentioned that earlier, the enabling the horse to forage and to have social abilities. I say, pull down those bars between the stables. It's okay to have stables. Of course, I'm fine with that, and I've stabled horses myself, and I have stables, but it's really important that the bars between the stables are removed so that the horse can at least choose to talk to each other if they want to, because that enables a major part of the horse's natural behavior. And also the importance of exercise and, as I said, foraging, etc. Good, clear training. There are also situation-related effects that are, this is part of the more recent approach in animal welfare, and things like, we need to question how we use whips. The bad effects of tight nose bands, hyperflexion, tongue ties, even girths. What do we do about that? Maybe that is okay, because many horses, when we put the girth on, don't react at all. So it's possible we've selectively bred horses to deal with the girth. But it's something that's worth considering, how we do deal with inescapable aversives. And I have a strong belief that we've selectively bred horses to deal with the girth, but we haven't ever selectively bred them to deal with what we do to their mouth or their tongue, or flex them, or cramp their nose shut, because these are very much more recent things. This diagram on the right-hand side just basically explains those losses of agency and the importance of veterinary care and good physiology at the bottom. And above the line, that's about welfare, enabling the horse those socialisation and foraging effects, etc. So moving further. I'm sorry, I'm going a bit over time now, so I thought I would get through this more quickly. But basically, when we give age, we need to give the aid at the beginning of a stance phase, and that's why the walk is so valuable. So we give the leg aid or the rein aid just as a limb leaves the ground. That's the most ideal. If we get it wrong, it doesn't matter too much because there'll be another limb that's about to do it too, but it just lowers the efficiency. And that's why training the horse to walk through the use of the legs for go at the right moment, or the leg yield at the right moment for when the hind leg's about to leave the ground, or with a rein aid for shortening just as the forelimb is about to leave the ground. That's the perfect timing. And when the horse gets these good habits, that's when we can start to make big progress and go into the trot and expect similar reactions in the trot. So basically we can, in the faster gaits, make a few mistakes in timing in terms of nanoseconds if we've trained the horse well in the walk. I think do as much as you can in the walk. The central pattern generator are the two big areas in the spine that control the gaits. It's not under brain control. So the gaits of walk, trot, and canter are actually controlled within the spinal cord, whereas tempo, that is the speed and the direction, are controlled by the MLR region, the mesencephalic locomotor region in the brain. So there's this sort of interesting dynamic control of what we do. So it's quite complex, but we don't need to go into that too deeply, except to say, again, try to be as clear as you can in the walk in when you give the aid and when you release the pressure from reins and legs and give the positive reinforcement. Forelimbs are the most important part of the horse's movements, because in the forelimbs, the signal goes from there to the back, not the other way around. There's feedback from the hind limbs, but the forelimbs, the front legs, basically tell the hind limbs what to do. And that's why getting the shoulders on line is really valuable. If the horse is crooked, don't straighten him with your leg to get the hind legs back on line. Use an indirect turn to bring his shoulders back on line. It works much more effectively. So what riders try to do is to get control with the reins and legs of these diagonal couplets, because the horse works in diagonal couplets. And that's the most effective way. And then finally, crookedness is a big problem, and that largely arises in the neck, not the body. It can, of course, start from the fact that the forelimbs are not under control. As I said, they predominate in the way they tell the back legs what to do. So the shoulders can fall in, fall out, bulge in, bulge out. That's why shoulder control is very much emphasized by many good trainers. But when that happens, if the horse's neck is short, then they get a bulging in the neck. And the bulging of the neck when the neck is short can cause all sorts of issues in the horse's neck, where at one or two particular vertebrae, there's some compression. So that compression can occur on the spinal nerves, on the spinal cord itself, and the articular surfaces of the vertebrae can be irritated. And those things, in the pain and inflammation that arises from that, can actually make the horse much more hyperreactive and start to show behaviors that you don't want. And it can also be the downward spiral. So straightness is a very important thing. And I think that's why it's so important to recognize that work that many trainers do focus on in terms of straightness. And if you'd like to see more about the importance of all of these elements that give the horse a good life, I would suggest you have a look at that website, www.equitationscience.com, and look up the first training principles, because these are all of the things I've basically covered in my journey today. And I think this has been a long program of putting together these training principles. It's been 20 years. I've been working with many authors on this, mostly Professor Paul McGreevy, and the iterations of these have changed a lot over the years as it's gone under peer review and scientific scrutiny. It's been massively peer reviewed, and I think these are very clear now. And these are the basic 10 principles, not just for horse training, but basically for training any animal, but they're fundamentally important for good mental welfare and for effective training. And that's really what the aim of this presentation is about. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. That was fabulous as ever. I think I'm going to have to watch that back again because there's so much information. I'm going to have to watch it a few times. It's brilliant. We've got some questions rolling in. Shall I go first with the first one? Okay, Claire says, habits in humans, oh, this is so true. Habits in humans are so easy to develop and can go unnoticed. Sometimes I cluck at my horse, not sure I was actually ever taught this. Can a human or a horse actually unlearn non-useful habits? And how long does it take to retrain both the horse and the human?
That's a really interesting question. Well, the horse can unlearn it. We have to be very consistent. The beauty of these things is that, you see, classical conditioning and these sort of signals and the way we use our voice, posture, anything that's a predictable element associated with operant conditioning, any of those things are quite superficial. That's why I'm talking about operant conditioning, like the use of pressure release with the reins and the legs and the use of reward are really fundamental and deeply embedded, whereas classically conditioned signals are fairly flippant. You know, they're optional, and you only have to get it wrong a few times and you can start to change. And the reason the horse is so flexible like this is, and all animals mostly are, especially those that migrate, because you've got to adopt new signals in a new environment when you migrate from north to south like the zebras do and all that sort of thing. So yes, it is quite flexible. How long does it take? It can, depending on how long the horse has practiced it, is probably part of the answer. I think it takes longer for humans to do it, for us to change our habits, than it does for the horse, because it's all to do with us. It's all to do with how clear we are and how consistent we are in changing what we do. But I agree, many people click and cluck and say words that in the end make voice commands, voice aids, completely meaningless to the horse, and therefore you just rob yourself of an effective tool. And it's the same as flapping legs. It kills the go aid. Inconsistent rein aids kills the effect of the reins. That's why, you know, basic horsemanship and equitation is so vital.
You're on mute, Heidi. You've done the mute thing.
Oh, it's just
for a while.
I've done that for a while. I'll let Beer ask the next one.
I actually had a question just related to that exact point as to whether you would, and it sounds like you wouldn't recommend always combining voice with positive reinforcement. So does that kind of help the human more than the horse by the sounds of it?
Yeah, it does. It definitely helps the horse too, though. I didn't mean to give that impression, because there's evidence that a soothing voice, of course, is a positive thing for animals. We already, you know, animal people already knew that, but that has now been shown. But what I'm saying about with voice, when you reward, if you always just say the same word, so I would suggest say something like good or good boy, if you want to say, you know, gender it, or good girl. But whatever you do, say the same sound every time when you're going to reward, and don't ever say it if you're not going to reward, which is the problem. You know, people say good boy, and the horse, you know, it becomes white noise because there's nothing good for the horse. Nothing good comes out of it. But every time you scratch him on the neck, if you just before you scratch him, say, good boy. That becomes a very powerful tool. And I have just so many examples and stories and experience of how effective it is if you do it well.
That's interesting. I do want to just labour that point a little bit then, because I'm really interested. So if, for example, if you're lunging and they you ask them to trot and they go into a trot, simply using the voice and saying good isn't backed up with a scratch or anything positive from their point of view. So actually that's probably is that a poor example? So
no, it's actually the best. It's actually the one that I use to. It's the best example because it is a moment when you can't. But you see, it doesn't matter. It's all to do with consistency and the amount. Like it doesn't have to be. I'm making it sound like it's got to be 100%. We aim for that, but there are going to be moments like when you're lunging where you can't. You can still say it, and it will still have a rewarding effect. It's just the more you do it without associating the reward, the more diminished it becomes. So if you say good boy when he's on the lunge half a dozen times, but the moment you're with him and you say good boy and you back it up with a scratch, it automatically comes up to that good level again. So, you know, there are moments when you can't. That's very true when you're at a distance from the horse. But every time you're with him, I think it's really important to give him just a little stroke on the neck and do it in the beginning with the young horse or the naive horse or the horse that apparently doesn't like touch, because there's no such thing in fact. But when people say that, you know, because he appears not to like touch, just keep scratching with the base of the neck until he actually does, because it's part of their telos. They're wired through the vagus nerve to lower their heart rate and lower their blood pressure and to appreciate touch. So I think, you know, we don't do it enough. It should be part of basic horsemanship that people learn to rub the horse at the base of the withers, and I think say the word before it.
Brilliant, thank you.
But that's a great question. I'm glad you raised that, because yeah, of course there will be times when you can't, but it doesn't matter. You can get away with it.
Brilliant, thank you. Question from Jen. Jen says, good evening, Dr. McLean. In all of my learning from you, I see training similarities with French classical equitation, particularly Philip Carl's École de Légeret, e.g. central pattern generator and the scales of training, etc. What are your thoughts compared with, say, the German classical system? Thank you. Sorry for my pronunciation there.
Well, I'll try and shorten it. I'm a really big fan of classical equitation, I have to say, because the old French principles were brilliant, and it was almost like they knew the basic science of it. For example, 1/8 at a time, separating, you know, the reins without legs, legs without reins is one of the principles of that, and that's so important. And I think very good German trainers do that and separate them. I know Rainer Klimke was one like that, where they would come. You know, because you can bring the aids really close together when the horse is well trained. It's rather like speaking quickly. Speaking in a sentence is quite a lot of aids, in a sense, one after the other, quite a lot of symbols. And they can come closer together the better we are with that language. When you're learning a new language, it's all got to be very much slower. And that's the same with training. But I think the mistake, you see, I think the Germans, what they really conceived very well were two things. One is focusing on rider position. I think they're outstanding with that, and the intense training of that. And the other thing is their division of getting the horse loose, the Losgelassenheit, and then Durchlässigkeit, where the horse is now more supple. Those ideas are good. I'm not a fan of the German training scale. I think part of it's good, but it could be improved. I actually think Borchet's training scale was basically better. The German training scale has no history, except for it's about 100 years old. It came out in the HDV 12 in the German military manual, and then it was never discussed until 1950s. Then it was briefly discussed and then put to bed, and then it suddenly emerged in the 1960s, and everybody said how wonderful it was. And I think that there are some issues that it does need, like in all sports, it needs revisiting. Having said that, I think where it's gone wrong with sport and medals in training for dressage and associated sports is that people have assumed, because some of this was poorly written by Steinbrecht in the German early German textbooks about reins and legs being together, because he talked about one should never be without the other. Well, I think what he meant was one after the other, and that's okay. You can go for half halt, you can go, rein then leg for go, or leg and then rein. But to do them together is nonsensical, because nobody can do two opposing things at once. You can't do slowing and quickening. So the moment you use a rein and leg aid at the very same time, for whatever purpose, you're going to be killing something inside. So that's where I like the French system. And I do think that there are some good moves afoot in Philip Carl's world to move forward with the science. I really do hope the German system does the same thing. I think there are possibilities. I really hope so.
Great.
Thank you. We've got another one from Jen, but I'm just going to bob one in the middle and then we'll come back to Jen. So question is, you were talking earlier about when a horse does something that's perhaps not perceived as very good, so kicking out. So they do something like that, or do something to put their human in danger, so perhaps they're a bit more assertive towards the human. What would you say would be a good way to respond and inform the horse that that's not acceptable?
Is this in handling, when the horse is being handled or ridden? Do you know?
Let's probably more likely to be, let's go with in hand. So you're handling them, so you are more vulnerable as a human, I guess.
My approach would be to simply ask another question and delete that one as quickly as possible. And what I mean is, when the horse does that, so for example, if you're walking, to kick out, they usually speed up or stall. There's a change in speed. So I would deal with the alteration of speed. Usually it'll be a quick motion. I would then, with the rein, I'd go woo and then go again and just ask another question. I think that the kicking out is going to be, it's nearly always a sign of the horse saying, I don't get that. It's not part of my world that I have understanding. And I think if we look at it from that point of view, we can just, it's rather like just ask the question more clearly, and but don't continue with the behavior. Like, for example, if the horse is doing that on the lunge, I wouldn't just allow the horse to full on buck. I think that's just really ridiculous. I think what you should do is use a rein aid and go woo, and make sure the rein aids therefore are well practiced and they work. So you can delete anything you want on the lunge with just the mildest of rein pressures, a little bit of a short tug, and then say, now go again. So basically delete and repeat is my answer. And it's the same under saddle, delete and repeat, and ask the question again, because really it's just a wrong answer to a question.
Okay, that's great, thank you.
Great stuff.
And I found that works very well too, by the way. That's something I've practiced a lot with myself, with horses and with pupils. It's really very effective.
I've written that down, delete and repeat. Thank you.
Yeah.
And there's a follow-up question from Jen. I fear for the future of equestrian sport when you see so-called elite riders clearly demonstrating raw cur. Do you think this will ever stop? Thank you.
Ooh, will it ever stop? I hope so. I think that it's a myth to think that you need to do it. I think there are other ways. I think that the end of Rainer Klimke in the 1990s, when he didn't win the World Championships in Los Angeles, and roll-cur type horses came in ahead of him at that World Championships, I think was the beginning of the end of dressage. And I really, rue that day, because everything's, because money and medals guided the whole thing. And of course it probably did up to them, but that's what I guess commodifying horses will end up doing. And we need to safeguard that. And So it's now, you know, horses are expensive to buy that move well, that win these competitions. We've really got to change the way we view horse sports, because otherwise they'll be stopped before we, you know, while we're left gasping and not even realizing. And so Rolka is part of that. And so I do see the day when it will end. I hope it doesn't end by stopping horse sports altogether. I hope it ends by people and by judging, not rewarding horses that have that go through this. I think it's important that we don't privilege that. Just from the point of view of horse welfare, I think this whole idea of, you know, that people talk about positive tension, I think if you come to this table in discussion looking from the horse's point of view of how best could you train the horse to do what we want, you will end up with much more along the lines of what Rainer Klimke was doing, which is much more of the old classical style, rather than privileging rounder and rounder and deeper and rounder, because, you know, horses can't even breathe effectively when they're down there. If the gullet's shut, there's up to 15% reduction in airway, according to recent research. So yes, I don't know the answer to the question. I really do hope it stops, but it's certainly less popular now. There's less of it, I think. But you know, maybe it just happens then on the sidelines or when nobody's watching or in the warm-up. I think it's definitely got to stop.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd all like to see that, yes.
Absolutely. And I think we are at the end of our questions for this evening. So that's been, as I said before, just an amazingly informative and fabulous presentation, Andrew. We thoroughly enjoyed that. Shall I just quickly share what's coming up?
Yeah, look, thank you very much for this. I appreciate it. And I'm sorry I went a little bit over time, because in our discussions I said, no, I don't think I'll be over time. If anything, I'll be under time. But I get a little, I'm really excited about these sort of topics, so I get a little bit carried away, and I love to tell people what I know about it. So anyway, thank you for putting up with that.
No worries. Well, we thoroughly enjoy it too. I think I think we're all guilty of running away with it and just getting absorbed in our passion for horses and doing things well by horses as well. I think it's so important that comes across. Your passion comes across so clearly. Just in terms of what's coming up for HorseTribe in the next few weeks. Next week we've got Steph Croxford, very down-to-earth Grand Prix dressage rider and founder of SH something TE Dressage United, which I'm sure some of you have seen on Facebook. Steph will talk about riding non-traditional dressage horses. She rides Dutch carriage horses in her dressage, and she's just great fun. I think everybody will love meeting her. Then we'll have a short break for Christmas and New Year, and we're coming back in January. So Liz Daniels is back again. This time she's going to help us clean our muddy monsters. So we're going muddy to marvellous. We've got Simon Kokoza coming on the 30th of January, talking about some of his exercises to help with kissing spine horses. And then Justine Harrison's coming back again on the 20th of January to talk about fear and what we can do to help our horses so they're not fearful. So that's what's coming up.
Just to pop in another date before you go, Andrew is back. It's the 3rd of February UK, so it will be your morning of the 4th of February, Andrew. So we have you back for a 3rd webinar. We're really looking forward to it.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, so thanks everybody.
Oh, hold on, I've just got to read this out. This is the most lovely comment I've ever seen. Lynn says, please can Andrew adopt me?
Oh,
oh, that's lovely, thank you.
Thanks for that, Lynn. And Heather also says, thank you for this webinar. It's so thought-provoking. Yeah, it's been absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much, Andrew. And thanks everybody for coming. We hope to see you again soon.
Yeah,
well, thank you all very much, and have a great Christmas and New Year break.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, you too. A very sunny one.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.